The Life of Abraham Lincoln, Introductory Chapter. The prominent feature of Abraham Lincoln's life is the fact that, from first to last, he was a truly representative man of the people. In whatever position of private life or of public trust he was placed, whether in the frontier cabin, the modest law office at Springfield, the halls of legislation, or the presidential chair at Washington, he always maintained the same truthful and noble character, winning the confidence of the people and eliciting from all who came in contact with him a degree of personal affection and enthusiasm which has been given to no other American statesman of our day, unless it be to Henry Clay, whom he so highly respected and in no slight degree resembled. The world indeed has seen many men who, by the grace of their manners, the force of their intellect, or the splendor of their achievements, have obtained a strong hold upon the popular heart. Yet the homage universally accorded to them was the result rather of a certain fascination than of sincere affection. France had her Napoleon, who rose from the people and adroitly used that fact to subserve his personal ambition. Yet he was not of them, although he enjoyed their idolatry. Their national pride was gratified by the dazzling success of one who, soaring from their own level, had proven himself equal in abilities to the proudest monarchs, the ablest generals, and the most finished statesmen of his time. But the calmer judgment of history, sifting the real from the unreal, will record that the emperor loved his people, if love it can be called, from motives of self-interest. Even our own illustrious Washington, the very polar star of American patriotism, honored with an ever-increasing fame throughout both continents, represented in his day the higher intellectual and social phase of American society, rather than those humbler circles of thought and action in which the masses move and have their being. The influence of gentle blood, the advantages of education, wealth, and position, which molded his earlier life, conspired to make him the representative of the aristocratic class. And though the purity of his personal and public life, his unswerving patriotism, and the power of his well-balanced intellect gained for him the sincerest affection of his countrymen, that affection ever was and ever will be mingled with a species of awe which seemed to set him apart from ordinary mortals. But Lincoln, while living, and yet more truly since his death, holds a not inferior place in the hearts of his countrymen. It has been happily said of him that what Robert Burns has proverbially been to the people of his native land, and to a certain extent of all lands as a bard, Abraham Lincoln seems to have become to us as a statesman and a patriot, by his intimate relations alike with the humbler and the higher walks of life. By the unstudied and truthful exercise of the native talents with which God endowed him, and under circumstances comparatively unfavorable, he was raised, apparently by the continued and universal suffrage of his fellow citizens, from a place of humble obscurity to a position and a fame equaled only by that of Washington. And the secret of his success was simply this, that he never, for one moment in all his varied experiences, forgot that he was of the people, never in a single instance neglected their interests. The people also fully comprehended him. They remembered that his experiences, whether of gladness or of sorrow, had been the same as theirs, that the great principles of justice and humanity underlying their own happiness, rights, and feelings were deeply enshrined within his heart. They knew, too, that unstained by temptation and unswerved by success, he would always be, as he always had been, the champion and defender of their interests. His identity with the people was such, and such only, as common toils, experiences, and emotions could have produced. And in that identity of interest, feeling, and purpose was his power. A power which, from the beginning of his career to the latest hour of his life, was never weakened by the blasts of partisan detraction or by any demerit of his own. In person also, as in principle, he was a truly representative American. His gaunt and bony form, firmly knit by the labor of a frontier life, was, to the people, a constant reminder that his earlier years had been spent amid scenes and trials with which they were themselves familiar. His features were plain and homely, but they were illumined by thoughtful eyes, tenderly described by one who knew him well as the kindest eyes that were ever placed in mortal head. and the habitual sadness of his countenance revealed the man of strong emotions, of earnest purpose, of infinite depth of feeling. His language was always simple, clear, and unequivocal. His style of argument familiar, logical, and generally pointed with a quaint illustration, an apt story, or an easy play of humor. His manner was such as might have been expected of the man, cordial, offhand, yet having an innate refinement which placed others at their ease, and so harmonized and softened his angularities as to invest with a certain dignity the harsher outlines of his tall and ungainly figure. He had also a straightforward way of handling subjects the most complicated and the most important, not with a self-conceited flippancy, but with a sort of everyday affair ease and simplicity of treatment which seemed suddenly to divest them of all extraneous matters, and to leave them so clearly defined in all their relations as to excite our surprise and admiration. Indeed, the rare art of putting things was possessed by this honest man in an eminent degree. The numerous perplexing questions which were constantly being developed by the progress of the war were treated by this Illinois lawyer with a freedom and fearlessness which could only have proceeded from a conviction that principles were always the same, whatever might be the magnitude of the case in question. In short, amid the Herculean responsibilities of a 4 years' war, such, for extent and principles involved, as the world had never before seen, amid questions civil, military, and political, amid defeats and party clamor, amid a multitude of counselors and varying counsels, amid the plottings of political generals and the blunders of incompetent commanders, honest Abe was always master of the position. Purity of intention, directness of purpose, patience and firmness in every situation and in every emergency ever marked his course of action. No public man, under the pressure of great responsibilities, adhered more strictly to Colonel Crockett's well-known rule of, "Be sure you're right, and then go ahead," and those familiar phrases which were so often on his lips, "We must keep pegging away," and "I have put my foot down," expressed the patient determination of a loyal but sorely tried heart. There was no Jacksonian swagger of, "By the Eternal," but there was an ever-present sense of his accountability to God for his acts, and a practical reliance upon his arm of strength in all that he did, which peculiarly characterized President Lincoln. "Pray for me that I may receive the divine assistance, without which I cannot succeed, but with which success is certain," were his words of farewell to the assembled friends and neighbors who bade him Godspeed when he left his Springfield home to enter upon the duties of the presidential chair. And again 4 years later, in his second inaugural speech, which now seems to us as one of his last utterances, he thus speaks to a great people whose sorrows he had borne and whose success was at hand. "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Such, then, was Abraham Lincoln, the natural outgrowth of free institutions. Indeed, such a character as his could not have been developed amid the deeply worn grooves and the limited influences of European society. It was as peculiarly American in all its features as are our great mountains, prairies, and watercourses, natural in growth, untrammeled in action, easy of adaptation to every varying circumstance of life, fearless in its courage, persistent in its purpose. If there is any truth in the theory that the mental characteristics of men are fashioned by the scenery amidst which they are reared, then must his life and character be taken as typical of our American genius and institutions. It was this man, so true, so self-poised, so honest, to whom, amid all his weighty responsibilities, no fault is imputed, except that of too much kindness, whose life we now purpose to write.